Welcome back, everybody. Patrons, of course, following on the Patreon account, thank you for the support. If you're seeing this as a free video, please consider all the content that's available for you if you become a subscriber. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. There's a link down there somewhere, wherever you're viewing this. Please do consider supporting me, supporting this work. There's a lot of content, a lot of stuff to cover, and most people aren't covering it. So please consider that. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about South Sudan, a country that often is not discussed very, very much. Civil war, I suppose, some people may know, a somewhat new country from last decade, created in 2011. Maybe some people know, but what's going on there? What are the details and why does it matter? I don't think most people have any awareness of this. So let's discuss a little bit, at least one aspect of this, and we will broaden it out to give you some understanding of South Sudan in general. Quick disclaimer before we begin: I am recording while both of my kids are outside playing. There's a good chance that they'll come in and disrupt this, so we shall see how that goes. All right, so this is put together as of October 22nd. I'm, of course, not going to be able to update any additional details that might become relevant after that point, but let's discuss. So there's a bunch of articles that's been written about South Sudan, the situation there. You can come at it from a lot of different angles. I personally, as a Marxist, but also as somebody who understands the dynamics of geopolitical conflicts, I'm always going to look at the economics. I'm always going to look at the material and objective reality there. And so let's look at the most significant, most critical economic aspects of the situation in the country to give us insight. So I'm going to work off of, well, this is really my own research, a collection of, many different sources that I've looked at, but let's just give credit where credit is due. The article that initially made me start thinking about these issues comes from AfricanMiningMarket.com. Headline: Is South Sudan on the edge? So I'm going to kind of summarize just a little bit of the economic data, and then I'm going to delve in a little bit more deeply into the political side of this, because that's of course going to be my strong suit. So South Sudan, why is oil such a critical question here? Well, South Sudan is almost entirely dependent upon oil. Okay, this is a country whose gross domestic product, I believe, was 98% dependent on oil in 2011 when the country was created. That is to say, carved out of what used to be the United Sudan, which is now separated into a Sudan and South Sudan. So when that happened, the vast majority of the oil in Sudan was kind of part of this new country of South Sudan, including some of these hotly contested, disputed areas like the Abyei province. As of 2018, 7 years later, 7 years after independence, they were still 90% dependent upon oil for revenue. So, and actually, it accounted for more than 1/3 of the GDP. So in fact, I may have misspoken there. It's 98% of revenue, 1/3 of GDP. Okay, so that's the dynamic here. So what does this actually mean? Well, this means that as the global oil market goes, so will go South Sudan. So that we have to keep that in the back of our mind as we think about some of the developments that have taken place there. So South Sudan rather, is considered the world's most oil dependent country. So what happened was, when the Civil War broke out, essentially right at independence, or maybe we could say a little while after South Sudan was created, the Civil War breaks out. I'm going to get into the details of who's involved in the Civil War in a second, but the Civil War breaks out and oil output is slashed in half. That, of course, drops revenues. It, of course, continues to expand poverty and all of the attendant issues associated with that. So now in 2018, you have production down to 170,000 barrels a day, which is just a tiniest drop in the world's largest bucket. And much of this has to do with two things. One is, well, the after effects and continuing effects of the Civil War, which kind of ended, but has since restarted and may or may not still be kind of on again, off again. We'll get into that. But other than the civil war, there's also the conflict with their northern neighbor, Sudan. Remember that although the oil is mostly in South Sudan, the oil infrastructure, that is to say, the pipelines and the trucking infrastructure, all of the rest of it that is required to actually bring that to the global market, that is mostly controlled by their northern neighbor. And so the disputes between these two countries have really led to a lot of Sudan basically shutting South Sudan out of the pipelines, et cetera, and creating problems of production and, well, really problems of sale and distribution for the South Sudanese. So now we're into 2020, and we have a new study which really confirms what I think a lot of investors had already known, namely that South Sudan's oil reserves are really considered only about 1/3 explored. So, in other words, there is a tremendous amount of oil yet untouched in South Sudan. So that, of course, raises a lot of questions. It raises questions about the future. It raises questions about who's willing to invest in a country racked by civil war and all of these other political and social and economic strife. So that is kind of where we begin our discussion, right? That this is a country that today in 2020, with these warring factions, with oil output down, and with global oil prices depressed as they are, this is a country very, very much teetering on the brink of collapse, on the edge, certainly for the poorest of the poor, which unfortunately continues to be the majority of the country. So now let's back up and talk about the war a little bit. Okay, because the war, I think, helps us to understand how we got to this point, the evolution of this war. So I'm going to put a lot of events into a very, very small nutshell here for the sake of brevity. But in the 1980s and 90s, this is a war that essentially breaks out in Sudan as a quote unquote a civil war. But in fact, it's not really a civil war so much as it is a war that in some ways is manipulated by the Sudanese military authorities in control of the country, that then kind of is transformed into an ethnic war. It's transformed into well, basically a really horrendous series of ethnic cleansings and turning ethnic groups against each other, divide and conquer strategy to a T from Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. So this was really one of the central conflicts that emerges out of the 2011 independence of South Sudan, namely the conflict between the two main ethnic groups, the Dinka and the Nuer. The Dinka have the presidency. President Salva Kiir, who was one of the leaders during the war, he is a member of the Dinka majority. But the vice president, a guy named Riek Machar, is a Nuer, and he is of this ethnic minority. And the origin of the civil war in 2013 is a split between Machar and President Salva Kiir, and Machar basically forming his own rebel army that carried out its own mass killings and so forth. So really, there's, just to be very clear, there doesn't seem to be any good guys in this fight here. But anyway, without getting into those moral discussions, so the Dinka and Nuer conflict is really at the heart of this. And what's interesting about that and how that relates to our understanding of this conflict is the fact that this well predates the war with Sudan. This well predates any of the nationalistic struggles. This goes back many generations, right? These are two groups that are rival pastoral groups. They have competed over grazing land. They have competed over water rights, wells and things of that nature, pastures. There's even a long tradition of cattle raids, one group against the other, as almost like a rite of passage for some of the young men. So there's a lot of conflict between these two groups that really has nothing to do with the politics in the North. However, it was that rivalry, that conflict, that ongoing strife, generational strife, that was capitalized on by Sudan during the war that really, sadly, it made the civil war basically into a sort of killing fields of Dinka and Nuer. In other words, they were the ones, these two groups that are mostly located in the south of Sudan, they were the ones that suffered the majority of the casualties for the entire country. So important to keep in mind that this wasn't really an independence struggle in the way that we normally think of it. This was a long brewing conflict that became very, very messy, that in fact the US, and I'll get to this in a minute, US imperialism used for its own geopolitical reasons, used a lot of these historical conflicts and grievances to kind of say, well, the country needs to be partitioned in two, and oh, by the way, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that hurts China, and that's good for the United States. We'll get to that in a minute. So the Civil War really kind of really sadly brought a sort of a new dimension to the conflict, right? Because the Nuer and the Dinka have been in conflict for, like I said, generations, centuries, right? But what happened was that the Civil War brought heavy weapons into the equation. It brought mass killing into the equation, not small arms and skirmishes, but mass killing, ethnic cleansing, genocidal behavior, but genocidal tactics, I guess we should say. So the Sudanese government, like I said, exploited these divisions. They used these conflicts for their own purposes. But just to get into the specifics, SPLM is the group to know. That's the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement. They were the rebel group in South Sudan. They were the ones that were kind of initially at the outset fighting against the government in Khartoum. But then, of course, that gets a little bit more complicated. So, in fact, one of the major divisions between Nuer and Dinka has to do with their respective positions during the 1980s and 90s in the war. So basically, the Dinka supported the SPLM, the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement. That's the South Sudanese rebel group against the government, and the Nuer supported the Sudanese government. So now, of course, once South Sudan becomes a country separate from the government in the north, well, one can see it doesn't take a tremendous amount of imagination to see how retribution would be on the table here, because the Nuer supported the wrong side. The Dinka, in the majority, are now in control of the presidency, and here you have your civil war and your ethnic cleansing. So this is part of the main problem here, is that so much of the killing in the Civil War happened between Dinka and Nuer in the South that now that war is really something that can't be gotten away from. It's almost as if the Civil War that has broken out in South Sudan is a continuation of the previous war, albeit with a different political flavor to it. So let's just quickly try to focus on the timeline here. 2005, again, 6 years before the creation of South Sudan, you have a peace agreement. Okay, and this peace agreement is what is supposed to put an end to the war in Sudan. I think many of us, if you're old enough, remember the a lot of the talk about genocide in Darfur. Well, that was really in a lot of ways part and parcel of this civil war. In fact, it was almost like a sort of an adjunct conflict to this civil war. So anyway, in 2005, you have a peace agreement, and the peace agreement creates an autonomous region of South Sudan. It didn't create South Sudan as a country. It created an autonomous region. Of course, as anybody could have predicted, that immediately leads to political conflict between the Dinka and the Nuer over control of this new autonomous region of South Sudan. Well, that struggle for power continues on for another 5 or 6 years. Finally, by 2011, again, the Obama administration, let's remember, this is the Obama administration's time, that South Sudan is officially created, and they join, the ranks of the countries of the world as the newest country in the world. And here we go. We've solved our problem. We've brought democracy to Sudan. We've resolved the crisis. Well, not exactly. As I said, these conflicts were only just beginning. The period of independence, the beginning of independence really kind of opens the floodgates for protracted conflict. So by 2013, so really about 18 months or so later, President Kiir, again, a Dinka, one of the dominant leaders from the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, somebody with a lot of muscle behind him, he ousts the vice president, Machar. okay, who represents the Nuer again. So once he ousts him, he basically says, look, I had to do it. Machar and the Nuer minority were planning a coup against the government. Well, this, of course, leads to a relatively small skirmish between forces loyal to Kir and forces loyal to Machar, right? Which in one sense is not really that big of a deal, right? Because they're both terribly corrupt, both are brutal, both have committed war crimes, and one of them will ultimately be leading South Sudan. But that's not the issue. The issue is the fact that it moves very quickly from a conflict between a Machar faction and a Kir faction into a full-scale Dinka versus Nuer conflict. That takes on, like I said in the beginning, the genocidal question. And maybe genocide is not the right word, but certainly mass killing along ethnic lines. Now, here we have to be also sort of cognizant of the reality of all of this. Like I said already, there are no good players in this equation. The South Sudanese army is absolutely culpable for probably the vast majority of the killing here. That would be President Kir. That would be his military forces carried out war crimes, crimes against humanity, all of those things. Obviously, that would need to be tried in the International Criminal Court or some other place, and that's not likely to happen so long as Kir remains the president. At the same time, Machar very much is also culpable for very serious crimes, including crimes against humanity, for mass killings and so forth during the conflict as well. That is the conflict inside of South Sudan. You have Kir and Machar as individuals with their factions. You also have, as a part of that, the Dinka versus Nuer kind of ethnic conflict. And then, of course, above that, you have these simmering, history between South, North, and within the South as well. So that's kind of the South Sudan dynamics on the ground. But now we have to pull back even further. We have to get the 30,000-foot aerial view because, of course, nothing is happening in Africa. Nothing is happening in Africa without some connection to the United States, China, and some of the other global powers. This has been true for a couple of centuries at least. This continues to be true today. We see that with regard to the US and AFRICOM. We see that with regard to Chinese investment in Africa, and so forth. We could go on and on and on talking about all of the ways in which Africa is a battleground among a number of different global players. But talking about the U.S. role here a little bit. So, as I already mentioned, the United States is the primary force driving the independence of South Sudan. Without the United States' blessing, there would have been no referendum. There would have been no partition of Sudan, right? So, the U.S. and the Obama administration, interestingly, using some version of responsibility to protect, right? The liberal humanitarian imperialist mantra, using some version of that to justify South Sudan, much in the same way that they did with regard to Kosovo and the creation of Kosovo as an independent country. And while there certainly is some justification for saying, the conflict was this, certainly there's no justification for suggesting that the United States should be the arbiter of what is and is not a region worthy of independence. Just ask the people of East Ukraine or Somaliland or any of the thousands of other frozen conflicts that the United States is not really, engaged in. Well, I don't want to go off on a tangent. They're engaged in those too, but that's a different issue. Okay, so the U.S. role, not only in the creation of South Sudan, but also, of course, in attempting to deprive the Chinese of one of their primary trading allies in Africa. In 2011, the Chinese were very dependent upon Sudan. Well, dependent as far as China can be dependent on a country in Africa. I believe it was 8 or 9 or 10%. I think it was 8% of China's total importation of oil was coming out of Sudan. Now, that oil, again, that was being pumped primarily out of the south and then piped up through the north to the ports, and then shipped to China, right? So now all of a sudden, here comes the U.S. saying, nope, we need to split the country up. South Sudan needs to be independent. They knew, of course, that would lead to a tanking of oil production. But what do they care? The oil production is going to hurt the Chinese more than anybody, right? Well, never mind the thousands upon thousands of Sudanese who might suffer and die because of that. That's a separate issue. The United States doesn't care, right? ultimately it was inherently about China and probably a number of other objectives as well. So the US is intimately involved in this. Of course, US imperialism is involved. How could it not be? But they're not the only ones. How about Israel? Let's talk a little bit about Israel. Israel has historically, for various reasons that we don't have time to go into now, but they have historically believed it was their place to meddle in the affairs of the Horn of Africa. Of course, there is the connection between the state of Israel and the indigenous Jews of Ethiopia. There is, of course, a long-standing history there that I also don't have time to talk about now. And for various reasons, the Israelis have made that part of Africa kind of part of their, let's call it, quasi sphere of influence, right? So the Israelis are deeply involved in Sudan. They have been for a very long time. One of the primary roles is in trafficking weapons. This probably comes as no surprise to people who follow what the Israeli state does around the world. But for many, they might not realize that Israel is so intimately involved in a lot of the war making in Africa, but they are. Lots of Israeli weapons got found on the battlefield in South Sudan. There were at least one, maybe numerous UN reports about that. The Israelis, of course, deny that they were directly involved in anything. They say that any weapon sales were done legally and so forth. But there's ample evidence to say that they're running guns and heavy weapons into that conflict zone. Separately from that, there is the question of how they're doing it. I think we could probably all agree that, Israeli-made weapons being on the battlefield in South Sudan is a pretty good indicator. But how is this happening? One of the interesting things I found in doing research on this subject, I want to say in like 2016, 2017, was the fact that the Israeli state uses literal government ministries as a front for running weapons into the country. So there was a massive water deal that was signed with one of the ministries in Israel, or a company. I forget what it was. I think it was a public, one of the government ministries. And the contract was to build a water system in South Sudan. Except the ministry that signed the contract doesn't do that. They ship weapons. So, I don't know whether it's sort of an open secret or whether it is something that they're trying to kind of do in a clandestine way, but are doing it badly. But either way you slice it, the Israelis are absolutely culpable for a lot of the killing in Sudan because they have been one of the primary sources for the weapons. And in fact, for students of the Israeli role in Africa, you could look back to the Israeli support for the apartheid government of South Africa, the Israeli role in bringing weapons, not only the nuclear question, but also bringing in small arms and heavy weapons into the conflicts in Rhodesia and so forth. So there's a long history of this as well. Now, to pull back even further, of course, and to kind of try to wrap this up here before my kids come storming in, there's the geopolitical question. China, as the trading partner of Sudan, this we know. China has, of course, managed to substitute, as everyone knew they would. The Chinese are not at all hurt by what has happened, although I would say they have a little bit more difficulty now in doing business there. They still are able to engage and still are able to do what they need to do to the extent that it matters. At this point now, global oil demand and demand in China has sagged so far that really the Chinese aren't all that interested, which is kind of comes back to the thrust of the original article that I talked about, that with a drop in oil demand, especially as a result of coronavirus, but not exclusively, because of this drop in oil demand, countries that are oil dependent are going to be hurting. So a country like South Sudan that is like almost entirely oil dependent could absolutely collapse. Now, what would social collapse mean? Hyperinflation, lack of basic goods, rekindling of civil war, all of that would be on the table. All of that would be a tremendous tragedy. And it would, of course, be entirely preventable. If the United States was not engaged in the way that it is in Africa in fighting against the Chinese on the continent in the various proxy form that it is, I doubt you would have the kind of struggles that you're seeing, the kind of conflicts that you're seeing, particularly since the Chinese have tremendous pull with all sides here. So the U.S. role, to the extent that there is one here, is certainly acting as anything but a force for peace. Now, it should be said, to be clear, it's not totally obvious the extent to which the Trump administration is even engaged right now in South Sudan. But to whatever extent they are, it's certainly not for good. So, what is the overall point in all of this? Why do we need to understand this? Well, because I think that we need to begin to wrap our heads around what the end of oil is going to look like here. It's not to say that people are going to stop consuming oil, that countries are going to no longer need oil, but the idea that a country can be entirely dependent upon oil revenue, I think may be a thing of the past. We've seen the effects of this sadly in places like Venezuela when the oil prices collapsed in 2014 and Venezuela was to a large extent set into a tailspin. Of course, sanctions and economic warfare and other things were also contributing to that. But we've seen this over and over again. Countries that are dependent in this way can really suffer. South Sudan already is suffering, already has a humanitarian crisis. How much more can those people take? Unfortunately, there's a lot more for them to come. Okay, that's all I got on South Sudan for today. Again, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. I'm pointing down because in theory, there will be a bubble with a link, but I don't know if I know how to do that, so we shall see. Patreon.com/Eric Draitser. This kind of stuff, but a lot more of it. Okay? Talk to you all real soon.